Hello and welcome. In a previous video about the Stockholm Leyland Atlanteans, I was saying that British Leyland and Leyland Motors, the company beforehand, were very much involved in the export of all things commercial vehicle, whether you're talking about trucks or indeed buses, as we normally talk about on this channel. Building vehicles for export was something that Leyland Motors did incredibly well. And at one stage you could travel around the world to places like South Africa, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand and Argentina, to name a few places that Leyland buses were to be found in. They even had them in the People's Republic of South Yorkshire, and that's saying something, isn't it? Over the years, Cuba had also been quite an important customer for Leyland vehicles. In 1950, Leyland launched the Royal Tiger, and this was an immediate export success, with the largest single order coming from Autobuses Modernos S.A. of Havana in Cuba, which was a new company formed to replace Havana's tramway network by buses. Now this required a completely new fleet of buses, and the Cubans ordered a total of 620 Royal Tigers, and at the time that broke several records for both size and value of export orders, although in the end 50 were diverted elsewhere. And although this order was hampered by the bodywork manufacturer Saunders ceasing production of bus bodies in 1955, it went on to show that Leyland was a big player when it came to exporting buses. In 1948, London was host to the Olympic Games, and at this time Leyland was working with bodybuilder MCW to launch an underfloor engined integrally built bus. This was to become the Leyland Olympic, the name inspired from the recent games being held in London. Again, this became another popular bus when it came to exporting. In fact, the Leyland Olympic was much more of a success as an export than it was in the domestic market. And again, Cuba played a huge part in this by ordering a total of 1,192 Olympics between 1960 and 1970. In fact, 33% of all output of the Leyland Olympics was for Cuba. Some were built as 44-seat two-door buses, and some were built as 41-seat express buses. Now, had the world been a very different place in the early 1960s, we would probably leave the story there and give Leyland a congratulatory slap on the back. However, unfortunately, the world wasn't a different place. And this is where we leave the safe and happy world of buses to go into worldwide politics. I'm not going to overly complicate this, and I might make it sound incredibly simple and basic. I'm going to tell it in a layman's way because, be honest, we're here for the buses, aren't we? It's fair to say that both Cuba and the United States of America haven't always seen eye to eye, despite their reasonably close proximity to each other. In the early 1960s, things reached a little bit of a climax. In 1961, the USA installed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey and in Italy, and at the same time was training a group of expatriate Cubans to launch a terror attack and guerrilla war on the Cuban government, with a view to overthrowing it. Now obviously this worried Russia because they actually got on quite well with the Cubans, but they were worried about this pushing Cuba more towards allying with China, who at the time the Russians didn't really get on with. It's complicated, but stay with it. This led to a meeting between the leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, and the leader of the Cuban government, Fidel Castro, and the result of this meeting was that the Soviets would be allowed to put their nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, as you can imagine, this angered the United States of America, and the nuclear clock ticked a little bit closer to midnight. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was born, and it's highly regarded up until fairly recently at least, that this was the closest that the world had ever come to nuclear war. And ever since this time, the United States of America put a trade embargo on Cuba, an unofficial one, but any country, company or shipping line that was found to be supplying trade to Cuba was blacklisted by the United States of America. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, kept up this unofficial blockade. Now, the deal for Leyland was worth £10 million and didn't just include buses, it included spare parts and also the option to train up mechanics for the Cubans, so that they would have people who could fix the buses as well as drive them, which is an important part of bus operation, I'm sure you'll agree. The 1964 orders from the Cuban government called for 400 Leyland Olympics, with options up to 450 more. Eventually, 850 would be delivered. And these vehicles defied those trade sanctions that the United States had put in place. And the refusal of Leyland Motors to abide by the boycott to Cuba would make Leyland a household name way beyond the world of bus and coach manufacturing. And this brought Leyland Motors an awful lot of publicity. And as somebody once said, there is no such thing as bad publicity. However, the reality of logistics of getting the ships to Cuba soon caught up with Leyland Motors. Having near completed the buses, they were looking for a shipping company to ship the buses out to Cuba. However, due to the potential of being blacklisted by the United States of America, no shipping company would take the order on. And it's rumoured that a desperate Leyland Motors actually wrote to the British government to see if it could borrow an aircraft carrier to ship the Olympic buses out on that. However, this request was politely ignored by the UK government, as they didn't probably want to get drawn into the whole thing as well. And also, can you imagine the reaction of the Cubans to see a Royal Navy aircraft carrier steaming towards them? It potentially could have started a rather nasty diplomatic incident. In the end, Leyland Motors managed to get an East German ship to carry the buses across to Cuba. It's interesting that it was a ship from behind the Iron Curtain, wasn't it? The ship was the 9,656-ton MV Magdeburg, which had been built in 1958. Now, this is where things get a little bit murky and potentially the CIA get involved. On the 27th of October 1964, the Magdeburg had left Dagenham docks and was steaming down the River Thames towards the Thames estuary, carrying 42 of the Olympics heading towards Cuba. Steaming the other way was the Japanese freighter, the Yamasharu Maru, and just off Broadness Point, the bow of the Japanese freighter sliced into the side of the East German ship. The Magdeburg rapidly listed and filled with water and sank. Unfortunately, there was no casualties amongst her crew. However, the buses that the ship were carrying were lost. The total value of the Leyland cargo, including the spares, was £400,000, yet the salvage operation realised only £27,000, resulting in a very heavy loss for the insurance. And Leyland and MCW built additional buses for the Cubans to replace the ones lost on the ship. Now, there has been all sorts of claims over the years that the collision was made deliberate by the CIA, who were trying to enforce the unofficial embargo against trade with Cuba. In February 1975, the Washington Post carried an article saying that the collision had been deliberately planned by the CIA. As you can imagine, this claim was denied by both the United States and Britain, who both probably wanted to keep that relationship special between the two of them. So I will leave that up to you to decide whether it was the CIA or whether it was just an unfortunate accident. I must admit, it does seem strange that the Americans would use a Japanese freighter to instigate something like that if they had planned it, but then stranger things have happened, haven't they? Around the time that the Washington Post article was written, a former CIA operative was questioned about it, and he said that he didn't think that the CIA was involved with colliding the two ships. However, the CIA were involved with sabotaging the Leyland buses at some point. The buses that had been on deck on the MV Magdeburg were salvaged and were taken off the ship. Some of these could still be driven, and these were later auctioned in Britain. However, when the ship was salvaged, there were still 14 buses in the hold, and after being salvaged, the ship was towed towards Greece by a Greek salvage firm. However, it ran into a storm in the Bay of Biscay and sank, taking those 14 buses with it. The remains of the vehicles that were salvaged from the wreck went on to have rather interesting careers. The running units from 2 Olympics were salvaged and sold to Smiths of Wigan, who fitted them into integral Van Hool coachwork. These became left-hand drive 44-seat coaches, which Smiths used for the continental work. These were registered CEK 587 and 588D, and being left-hand drive caused a little bit of controversy as they were UK registered, and technically they could have been used on hires within the UK, although as I said they were intended for continental use. Other running units salvaged from the shipwreck became furniture vans, and one became a car transporter, whilst the rest of the complete vehicles were allegedly sold abroad. Now Leyland must have thought it was jinxed selling these buses to the Cubans, because would you believe it, the MV Magdeburg was the second ship that had issues with the delivery of the buses to Havana. In 1960, 18 buses were being unloaded at Havana docks when a nearby French ship which was carrying ammunition, the MV Le Coubre, exploded at a nearby berth. All of the buses were damaged. However, 9 were repairable in Cuba, but the rest went back to MCW for repairs. And incidentally, when it was repaired, one of these buses was lent to Edinburgh Corporation. Edinburgh had been keen to try 11-metre long buses, but obviously this was a left-hand drive and couldn't be used in service, but it allowed them to look over the vehicle, see the layout and get a feel for the actual size of the bus. And this would lead Edinburgh to be the launch customer for the PSU-3 Leyland Leopard. So there we go, we've reached the end of the story of the Cuban Leylands and the possible involvement of the CIA. What do you think? Do you think the CIA were involved? Answers down below. I hope you've enjoyed this rather special episode of Classic Bus Histories, and I hope that all the politics and conspiracy theories haven't put you off too much. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out my future releases in this and my other series here on YouTube. Thank you so very much for watching. It does mean an awful lot to me that you continue to support this channel. All money raised by YouTube goes towards the upkeep and restoration to the Southern Counties Omnibus Collection buses. Once again, thanks for watching. Bye for now.